Michael B. Jordan sat alone at a dimly lit corner table of the elegant, yet strangely quiet restaurant tucked into the edge of the city, a place he had never been to before but had been told served the best sea bass in town, and with a schedule that barely let him breathe. A rare quiet night like this one felt sacred, a moment to unwind without cameras or scripts or masks, just a man with a plate of food trying to feel normal again. Yet something about the atmosphere felt slightly off, like the stillness before a storm, a silence too deliberate, too heavy, and he noticed it not in the noise, because there wasn't any, but in the looks, the subtle shifts. The way the hostess had paused just a second too long before seating him, the way the other diners seemed to glance, and then quickly glance away, as if trying not to be caught watching. And though he'd grown used to attention over the years, this felt different. Not the wide-eyed admiration of fans or the quiet jealousy of those who recognized his success, but something colder, tighter, and as he slowly cut into his meal, letting the flavors distract him, footsteps approached, deliberate and soft, the sound of polished shoes on marble floor echoing louder than it should have, and when he looked up, the waitress stood there, a pale woman in her late 30s, blonde hair tied too neatly, a frown pulled tight across her face like it had been set that way permanently, and without greeting, without smile, without even pretending courtesy, she said flatly, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Just like that, no warning, no reason, no nothing, and Michael blinked, thinking maybe he'd misheard, fork still halfway to his mouth, his brain trying to catch up to the surreal bluntness of the moment. So he said, calm but confused, "Sorry," and the waitress folded her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly, like she'd expected him to challenge her, and she said again, slower this time, with a kind of disgust in her voice that burned more than it shocked, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Now. We don't want you here." And Michael set the fork down, his hand tightening just slightly as he swallowed whatever bite was still in his mouth, his voice still calm, but now with an edge, a sharpness she either didn't hear or didn't care to hear. "Why?" And the waitress, with a little tilt of her head that made her look both smug and hostile, said the words that seemed to echo too loud, too long, like the restaurant itself held its breath waiting for the impact. "Because you're black. I don't want to see black people in here." And for a second, time slowed, like his mind refused to accept that what she'd said could actually be real, like some cruel joke. Like a scene from an old movie he thought the world had moved past, but it wasn't a joke, and it wasn't a movie, and no one was yelling, "Cut." And he looked around the room now, really looked, expecting at least one face to show shock, someone to stand up and say this was wrong, but no one moved, no one said anything, just the clinking of a glass in the distance and the low hum of the air conditioning, and Michael's chest tightened, a slow, rising panic tangled with disbelief. And all he could say at first was, "You're serious?" And she nodded, no hesitation, her voice quieter now, but even more chilling. "Yes, I am. Leave now, or I'll get security to make you." And Michael stood slowly, not because he agreed, not because he was scared, though maybe there was a flicker of fear there, of what would happen if this escalated, but because something inside him told him this moment mattered more than just him, that this wasn't just about dinner or insults, that he had to be careful, because even famous people could be cornered in silence. And he said, quieter now too, "You can't talk to me like that." And she laughed short and sharp, like she'd heard a child say something ridiculous. "Watch me." And she turned, gesturing toward the front as if that alone would be enough to eject him. And for a second, Michael stood frozen in place, heart pounding not just from anger, but from a deep, familiar ache, the one he thought he'd left behind when he made it, the one that told him no matter how successful, how admired, How famous! There would always be rooms like this, doors like this, people like this. And he looked down at his half-eaten food, then back at the woman's rigid back as she walked away, already reaching for something behind the counter, and he waited, unsure what he was waiting for, unsure what would happen next, only knowing that something in this moment was far from over. Michael stood there for a moment, the air around him growing heavier with each passing second, the murmurs from nearby tables like distant echoes underwater, and though he tried to steady his breath, to keep his expression calm, inside his thoughts were spiraling, twisting between disbelief and something sharper, something that clawed at old wounds he thought had scarred over years ago. And he looked at the woman again, really looked at her, her cold expression, her squared shoulders. The way her lips curled with contempt like this wasn't the first time she'd done something like this, and in a voice that trembled not with fear, but with the weight of holding back anger, he said, "Why do I have to leave?" And she didn't blink, didn't hesitate, just looked him in the eye and said, "Because you're black," as if the word was something rotten in her mouth. "And I don't want to see black people in this restaurant." And those words hit him harder the second time, because now there was no mistaking them. No way to pretend this was anything other than what it was, and the silence that followed felt like a punch to the chest, and even though the room was full, it felt like everyone had vanished, like it was just the two of them suspended in this awful, frozen moment, and something inside Michael cracked, not just from the insult, but from the sheer audacity of it. The confidence with which she said it, like she expected him to just nod and disappear into the night, and he took a breath, sharp and shallow, and replied, "You can't say that to me. You can't treat anyone like this." But she smiled, and that smile was worse than her words, because it was the smile of someone who had done this before, someone who knew she could get away with it. And she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "I can say what I want. And I'm telling you, if you don't leave right now, I'll call security. They'll drag you out if I ask them to. Trust me, they move fast." And there was something about the way she said it, so casual, so practiced, that made his stomach tighten, because it wasn't just a threat, it was a promise, a routine. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt something close to fear curl in the pit of his stomach. Not the fear of violence exactly, but of being powerless, of being in a place where even his name wouldn't save him. And he looked toward the entrance, toward the counter where the hostess now stood pretending not to hear, and then back toward the other diners, some of whom were glancing over now, whispering, nudging each other, but none of them moved, none of them spoke. And it dawned on him that maybe they were used to this. Maybe they came here often and knew this side of the place, and he was the outsider who just stepped into it unknowingly. And he clenched his fists just slightly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to feel the tension in his body solidify into something tangible, and he said again more firmly, "You don't have the right." And the waitress, undeterred, straightened her spine and nodded toward the back, where a dark hallway led to the kitchen and, presumably, the staff exit. "Go out the back if you don't want a scene," she said, and now there was something almost taunting in her tone, like she wanted to see what he'd do, wanted him to protest, so she could escalate it. And Michael shook his head slowly, still stunned at how quickly this night had unraveled. "No. I'm not going anywhere. I came here to eat. I didn't do anything." And she rolled her eyes with exaggerated exhaustion, like she'd heard this all before, and then she turned and started walking toward the front, muttering over her shoulder, "Fine. I'll get the guards. We'll see how long you last once they get here." And Michael stood there, trying to decide whether to stay or go, whether to fight or walk away, but every option felt wrong. Every path felt loaded. and his heart beat louder now, not just in his chest, but in his ears, drowning out the low jazz playing in the background. And time seemed to bend, slow down, stretch, as he waited, unsure what kind of men would come through that front door next, what kind of reaction they would have. And as he watched the entrance, trying not to let his hands shake, the door opened and two large men in dark suits stepped inside, walking casually but with purpose, their eyes scanning the room until they landed on him, and for a split second his breath caught, because he didn't know what side they were on, didn't know if they'd believe the lie or if they already knew the truth, and the waitress pointed at him from behind the counter, her voice raised now. "That's him, get him out." And the two men glanced at her, then back at Michael, then at each other, and one of them, tall, bald, with a trimmed beard, walked over, his steps measured. And Michael prepared himself for the worst, for the humiliation, the force, the finality. But the guard stopped a few feet in front of him, glanced down at the half-eaten plate of food, then back at Michael, and something in his face shifted, a flicker of recognition followed by disbelief. And then he looked over his shoulder at the waitress and said loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear, "You didn't tell me this was Michael B. Jordan." And the other guard walked up beside him now, eyebrows raised, looking from Michael to the waitress and back again, and the first guard turned fully toward her. "You pulled us away from the door for this?" And the waitress stiffened, her face reddening. "I told you he was causing trouble," and the guard cut her off, shaking his head slowly. "No. You told us someone was being disruptive. That's not what this is. This is you being racist." Again, and that word, again, hung in the air like a thunderclap, and suddenly all the whispers around the room grew louder, turning into conversations, into phones being pulled out, into a wave of attention that now turned not on Michael, but on her, and she stepped back sputtering, He didn't belong here." And the second guard cut in, "Lady, you're the one who doesn't belong here." And then they turned back to Michael, their faces softening. "We're sorry, sir, we had no idea." "You good?" And Michael, still standing, still trying to process the whiplash of the moment, just nodded slowly, not trusting his voice yet. And one of the guards turned back to the woman behind the counter. "This is the last time. You keep pulling this crap, and they're going to shut this place down." And she didn't respond, just stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as the reality of what she'd done began to sink in. And Michael looked around the room now, seeing the shift in the air, the way people were watching her, not him, the way the spotlight had moved, and yet he didn't feel triumphant, didn't feel vindicated, just tired, deeply tired, because no matter what happened next, this had already happened, and he couldn't unhear those words, couldn't unfeel that moment of standing alone in a room full of people who said nothing. The moment the guards fully took in who was standing in front of them, something shifted, not in a forced way, not in the superficial politeness people sometimes put on around celebrities, but in an oddly familiar, almost resigned manner, like they'd been through this dance before. And as they looked over at the waitress still standing behind the counter, her face flushed with a strange mix of frustration and denial, one of the guards let out a dry, bitter chuckle, shaking his head slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. And the second guard leaned slightly toward the first, muttering just loud enough for Michael to hear, "It's her again, isn't it?" And the first one nodded with a smirk. Yep. Same story, different day. And that was when Michael realized this wasn't new, not even close, and the anger that had been boiling inside him now mixed with something else, confusion, disbelief, and a deeper sense of sadness, because this wasn't just a one-time lapse. This was a pattern, a routine baked into the bones of this place, and as the waitress caught their expressions, she tried to recover, folding her arms and snapping. He was being difficult. "Don't let him fool you. He was making other guests uncomfortable, but the taller guard laughed again, louder this time, drawing the attention of every table in the room. "You say that every time someone who doesn't look like you walks in here," and now both of them were smiling, not with amusement, but with that kind of exasperation that comes from seeing the same thing too many times and never being able to fix it. And the second guard turned back to Michael, his face softening with a mix of apology and fatigue. "Don't mind her, sir, she's been like this for a while. Management knows, but she's got ties with the owner or something, so she just keeps getting away with it. We've tried to get her fired twice." And Michael blinked, stunned, not because they were defending her, because they weren't, but because of how normalized it all sounded. How casually they talked about it, like this open racism was a feature of the place, not a flaw. And the taller guard, seeing the disbelief in Michael's face, added, "She doesn't even try to hide it anymore. If you're not white, she's got a problem with you. That's just how she is. Doesn't matter who you are." And that last part hit especially hard, not because Michael needed to be treated special, but because it confirmed that this wasn't about him personally. It was bigger, more insidious. And he looked at the woman again, who now stood silently behind the counter like a statue carved from resentment, not even pretending to be remorseful, just glaring at the guards like they'd betrayed some silent agreement. And for a second he wanted to say something, to call her out in front of everyone, to demand an explanation. But the truth was, there was nothing she could say that would make this make sense. And the more he stared at her, the more empty it all felt. So he turned back to the guards, who now stood casually, almost protectively between him and the counter, and asked quietly, "This has happened before? To other people?" And the second guard nodded. "More than we can count. Last month it was a couple, black man, white woman. Month before that, some Asian guy, she said, looked suspicious. She even got a Latino family kicked out once for laughing too loud. Always some excuse, but it always comes down to the same thing." And the taller one added, "She doesn't like people who aren't white, plain and simple. And no one's done anything about it, so she keeps going." And Michael shook his head slowly, the weight of their words settling into his chest like concrete. And suddenly the idea of finishing his meal felt absurd, grotesque even. And yet leaving without a word felt like letting her win, and he didn't know what the right move was. Didn't know what message he was supposed to send, but before he could speak, the second guard said, "You don't have to leave. In fact, we'd rather you stayed." Just to piss her off. And both of them laughed again, a quiet rebellion against the bitter air in the room, and Michael let out a breath, half laughing himself, not because it was funny, but because sometimes humor was the only armor left. And he looked around the room again, seeing the diners now openly watching, some with guilt, some with curiosity, a few even mouthing silent apologies he didn't ask for, and he wondered how many of them would go home tonight and forget what happened. How many would come back next week and tip that same waitress like nothing had occurred. And he sat back down slowly, his appetite gone but his resolve hardening, and said softly, "I'm not going anywhere." And the guards nodded, standing nearby now, not looming, just present, and the waitress stood still, her jaw tight, her hands clenched behind the counter. But she didn't speak, didn't approach, didn't try again, and something about that silence felt like the true end of it, not a victory, but a pause in the cycle, and Michael sat in that silence, letting it stretch, letting her know he wasn't afraid, and he didn't need to raise his voice to win. And as he sat there, he thought about all the times he'd let things slide, all the moments he didn't speak up because he didn't want to make a scene, and he realized this wasn't about making a scene, it was about not pretending anymore, about not letting the weight of someone else's hate bend your back. And the meal, forgotten now, sat cold on the table. But Michael stayed a little longer, not to prove anything, not for pride, but simply because he could, because she couldn't make him leave, and that mattered more than the food or the reputation or the fame. It mattered because some nights you just had to stand your ground, even if it meant sitting in silence while the whole world watched and said nothing. And when he finally stood to leave on his own terms, hours later, the waitress was gone. The guards gave him a respectful nod, and no one tried to stop him. No one dared. And as he stepped outside into the cool night air, he didn't feel triumphant, but he did feel intact, and sometimes that was enough, just to walk away whole.